And welcome back for more human physiology. So, next on our agenda is time to start talking about specific chemical reactions and the importance of enzymes. So, let's hop to it. So, last time we discussed different types of chemical bonds, with most of our focus being on both ionic and covalent bonds. So, a chemical reaction is going to occur when any type of chemical bond between atoms is either formed or broken. So that includes both the formation and breaking of bonds. A chemical reaction occurs in both cases. So to kind of tie into some of the energy and metabolism stuff that we talked about in chapter 1, chemical bonds store energy. So this is a type of energy called potential energy. So chemical bonds store energy kind of in the same way that a battery stores energy. So the idea here, again, to tie things back to chapter 1, in order to form a bond, energy is usually required. You have to put in energy, and that is why forming chemical bonds is a type of anabolic reaction. Remember, we are building things up. We are starting small and building things up. And then conversely, to break a bond, we release the energy that used to be contained in that bond, so that would be a catabolic reaction. So with catabolic reactions, we are starting complex and we are breaking down. The process of breaking chemical bonds releases energy that we can use. So some bonds just naturally are going to store a greater amount of energy than others, which is going to lead to kind of the idea that in nature, in biology, there is such a thing as high energy molecules and low energy molecules. So the energy contained in the covalent bonds of carbon dioxide and water are very low energy. You're not really going to be able to break those bonds and release any appreciable amount of energy. A little bit, but not very much. Whereas high energy molecules like sugars and fats and proteins, the chemical bonds that we break when we digest our food releases a lot of energy, which is why when we break those things down, we create low energy molecules like carbon dioxide and water. At that point, we have basically sapped all the energy out of the big food molecules that we can, and we are left with low energy carbon dioxide and water. So any specific chemical reaction is going to have a chemical formula associated with it, or an equation, if you will. So there is kind of a lot to digest here. So the reaction that you're looking at here, you may recall from general biology, is cellular respiration. So the subscripts, which are in red here, the subscript referring to a number that is by each atom, that indicates how many of each atom are present within that compound or molecule. So anytime you do not see a subscript, that is implicitly understood to mean 1. So if you look at water on the far right, the fact that there is not a subscript after oxygen means that there is only one oxygen atom. For carbon dioxide, the fact that there is not a subscript after carbon means that there is one carbon. The coefficient, which is the number that is circled in green there, is referring to specific mole ratios, meaning that, again, a lack of a coefficient is implicitly understood to mean 1. So this is basically how many parts this plus how many parts that yields how many parts this, right? So the way you would read this specific equation here is 1 molecule of glucose plus 6 molecules of oxygen will yield 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water. So it's basically telling you how many molecules of this have to react with how many molecules of this to give you how many molecules of your products. So the way I like to think of things like this is a reaction equation is kind of like a recipe. It's telling you the ingredients that you have to start with. Those are your reactants, how much of each ingredient that you're going to need, and what you're making, which in this case would be your products. And a lot of reaction equations will also list any other conditions that are necessary, like whether you need to add heat, whether the pH needs to be a certain level, whether energy is required or not required. So there should be a lot of information contained here. But thankfully for us in physiology, we are not going to be dealing with reaction equations very often. But just to make us aware of different types of equations, the first two that you see here using kind of words and parts of words as examples, There are two simple ones, then one that's a little bit more complicated. The first, which is called a synthesis reaction, is very much an anabolic reaction. So here we have note and book, two very simple words that we can put together. Essentially, we are forming a chemical bond between them to form one word, and that word is notebook. B, which is called a decomposition reaction, takes a very large word like bookworm, breaks the chemical bond between them to create two smaller words, book and worm. And this would be an example of a catabolic reaction. The decomposition reaction is sometimes also called a degradation reaction. And then in C, what is sometimes called either an exchange or replacement reaction, you take two reactants, one which is complex and one which is not complex, and basically a bond is broken, components switch places, and then a new bond is formed. Now, in these cases, predicting whether that type of reaction will be anabolic or catabolic is a little bit complicated, and you need to know specific details about the bond energies of the bond that is formed and the bond that is broken, and we are not going to worry about that. So if we come back to cellular respiration, which we were looking at before, this is going to be highly relevant to our study of human physiology because we already at this point understand that when your cells need to make energy in the form of ATP, they utilize cellular respiration, and we've already seen what the overall formula looks like. So what you're looking at here is that cellular respiration on the whole is going to be a catabolic reaction. It's going to go downhill, and we are going to release a lot of energy. Now, the catabolic reactions typically are what we call spontaneous reactions, meaning that they will occur spontaneously on their own. We don't really need to help them out too much. So this is true because glucose, if you just have glucose powder sitting about, glucose on its own will spontaneously combine with the oxygen in the air to combust into carbon dioxide and water. This will do it all on its own. You could just put some glucose on the countertop and then wait and wait and wait. Eventually, it will combust into carbon dioxide and water. But here's the issue. That process is going to be extremely slow. It will take maybe 100 years for that to occur. Now, if you're talking about cellular respiration in the body, we can't wait 100 years for a reaction to occur. So what your cells are going to do is stack the odds in their favor so that we can speed these types of chemical reactions up, so that rather than taking 100 years, cellular respiration can happen in the snap of a finger. So in order to understand how your cell stacks those odds in its favor, we need to understand the types of factors that affect the speed of a reaction. How can we stack the odds in our favor? So the first factor is the surface area / reactivity of reactants. So the idea here is that in order for two reactants to form a chemical bond, they need to come together. Those two reactants have to collide with one another. Two reactants cannot form a chemical or break a chemical bond if they are in two completely different places. So the idea with surface area, the idea is the higher the surface area, the more opportunities there are going to be for collisions. So surface area, we're usually talking about the surface area of the cell membrane or something like that. Number 2 on the list is temperature. So this is a topic that we've already delved into a little bit in Chapter 1. So we've already seen that increasing the temperature is going to cause molecules to start moving around more quickly. So this is referring to the kinetic energy those molecules have. So the idea here is that the faster the molecules are moving, the more likely it becomes that the two molecules of interest are going to collide with each other. But we've already cautioned ourselves that in biological systems, temperature increases will eventually denature enzymes that catalyze those reactions. And enzymes, very much so, are going to be a major topic in just a minute. The concentration of reactants is kind of along the same vein as the surface area argument was. So concentration is a measure of the number of particles of a substance dissolved in a given volume. So if the concentration is very high, you have a lot of molecules packed into a relatively small space. If the concentration is low, you've got a small number of particles packed into kind of a very open and large space. So your book does a good job of coming up with an analogy for this. Think of it like two dance partners that are kind of on the dance floor. If you have a very large dance floor and not many dancers, finding a dance partner is going to be kind of hard. If there's 5 dancers and 4 of the dancers are already paired up, then you're not really likely to find a dance partner. However, if you've got a dance floor that is very crowded with lots and lots of dancers, your opportunity to find a dance partner is that much greater. So with chemical reactions, it works the same way. 2 reactants have to meet together, similar to how 2 dance partners come together. And then the concentration of reactants can be actually changed by either increasing the number of particles or decreasing the number of particles, or by actually changing the volume of the space those particles occupy. And lastly, the most important factor that affects the speed of reactions is the presence of an enzyme. So in biology, these types of catalysts that speed up the rate of chemical reactions are called enzymes. Enzymes are almost always going to be proteins, but sometimes they are RNA, so more on that later. So as we previously mentioned, most chemical reactions like cellular respiration, even if they do occur spontaneously, they are way, way, way too slow to be kind of favorable for physiology if we just leave them by themselves. So an enzyme is going to speed up a chemical reaction by reducing the amount of energy required for the reaction to be what we'll call initiated. So that might seem like a whole bunch of gobbledygook, so let me put it another way. The enzyme essentially is going to force the 2 reactants to collide together. We're no longer really leaving it up to random chance. We're no longer waiting and waiting and waiting for the opportunity for 2 reactants to come together. The enzyme is basically saying, okay, you come over here, you come over here, you come together, form the chemical bond, and finish the reaction. So the way an enzyme speeds up a reaction, we mentioned, is that it reduces the energy required for the reaction to be initiated. That energy requirement is called the activation energy, and the best way to think about it is like a barrier that prevents the reaction from occurring spontaneously. So if you look at the graph on the left, you are looking at a reaction that overall goes downhill. If you trace a line from the reactants to the products, you'll see that overall it does go downhill. But the activation energy is that big kind of upslope that goes way, way, way up before then coming all the way back down. You could imagine if that activation energy barrier was just not there, we could go straight from the reactants down to the product. But because the activation energy is there, it acts as a barrier that prevents the reaction from occurring unless we meet a specific number of circumstances. And what the enzyme is going to do is drastically bring down that barrier. It reduces the amount of energy we have to put in order to get the reaction to occur. So because the amount of energy we have to come up with has been severely reduced, the reaction overall should happen much more quickly. And I actually came up with I think, pretty good analogy to kind of help you understand this. So forget enzymes for a second. Imagine that you want to go to the carnival or the state fair. So imagine that the admission fee is $10. So that's going to be kind of your activation barrier. That's your requirement, your barrier to entry. You have to pay $10 before you can go from being outside to being inside. So imagine that you left your wallet or you left your purse at home. So you don't have any money on you right now. You cannot get in because you do not have any money. But let's say you're bound and determined to get in. So let's say you go out into the parking lot, you dumpster dive, you look under cars, you're looking for loose change. So think about how long it would take you to look for $10. How long about do you think it would take you rummaging around in the parking lot before you find enough quarters and nickels and dimes to come up with $10? It would probably take a really, really, really long time. Well, this is what is happening to a reaction that is not catalyzed by an enzyme. We have the activation energy that has to be paid, and basically the reason the reaction takes a long time is because it takes a long time to come up with that amount of energy. So consider a new case. You still forgot your wallet or your purse at home, but let's say your best friend is working the ticket booth and says, hey, I can get you a big discount. You don't have to pay $10, you only have to pay $1. How's that sound? Okay, so the idea here is that you still have an energy cost to pay, but it's been severely reduced. So do you think it would take less time to come up with $1 in change or $10 in change? So obviously it would take you much less time to rummage around looking for $1 rather than $10. So you ought to be able to get into the carnival much more quickly. And then, as you can probably identify, your friend in the ticket booth would be the enzyme in this analogy because they are the ones that is responsible for reducing the admission cost, bringing down the activation barrier. So the importance of this activation energy barrier, it seems like a very inconvenient thing, but it's actually extremely important to the stability of your cells, of your molecules, and of your whole body. So imagine for a second that this energy barrier did not exist. Well, all the molecules in your body that have those high energy chemical bonds, like carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids, the things that actually make up your cells and make up your body, they could just spontaneously fall apart on their own. So if those things are going to fall apart, if their chemical bonds are going to break, then if there's no energy requirement, those sort of things could just happen willy-nilly, meaning that we really have no sort of stability in our life. So what enzymes do, what enzymes allow for is there are going to be times in which we need to break the chemical bonds of some of those molecules, but it's not going to be that often. So what the energy barrier does is make sure that when there is no enzyme, these things are nice and stable, and they're not just going to break apart on us willy-nilly. But there will be times and places for these things to occur, and enzymes can be selectively turned on or created to catalyze those reactions in the correct place and at the right time. So kind of the conclusion you can take away from this is that most of the chemical reactions in your body are much too slow to occur by themselves. So just about every relevant chemical reaction in your body has an associated enzyme that is responsible for it. Now, not every enzyme is active or present all the time, but your body, part of what it is supposed to do is regulate these enzymes to make sure that these specific chemical reactions happen at the right place and at the right time. So that's going to do it for this particular video. So next time we will start discussing the difference between organic and inorganic compounds with a particular emphasis on the inorganic molecule water and its specific properties. So I will go ahead and sign off.